Wade Miller. All my friends call me Wade, so please refer to me as Wade if you're ever communicating with me. I am the South Central Regional Coordinator for Heritage Action, which, as she said, is the political action arm, kind of a sister organization to the Heritage Foundation. And for those of you not familiar with the Heritage Foundation, I'm sure most of you are, but for those of you who are not, it is a conservative public policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. that deals with federal policy. They've been around for about 40 years. They really kind of broke through as one of the preeminent think tanks in the world alongside the Reagan administration, where at Ronald Reagan's first cabinet meeting, he put out the Mandate to Leadership, which was a document, kind of a blueprint, a guide for the Reagan administration on what kind of policies we need to implement. And when Reagan put this in front of his cabinet members at the very first meeting, he said, you know, this is our plan, this is what we're doing. And they got about 65 to 70% of those policies implemented, and we think that the results were fairly positive, and we've kind of been going with that ever since. We've been really steeped in kind of the Reagan brand of conservatism, limited government, fiscal responsibility, pro-free markets, not pro-big business type of mentality. So I did intern there for a while. Now I'm with Heritage Action. And the reason Heritage Action got started is because on the backside of the Obamacare loss, and it was a huge loss, we got just completely destroyed on that debate and during that legislative process, it became very apparent that we were being outclassed and outmatched on the lobbying side of the issue. We could put out as much documents, as much research as we wanted to. We could not compete on Capitol Hill, in the Senate office buildings, in the House office buildings, with every single lobbyist trying to get their hands in the pockets of the taxpayers and pledging their support behind Obamacare. So Heritage Action was basically started on the premise that we need to push back against the lobbyists. And in fact, in a weird way, we're kind of the anti-lobbyist lobbyists, and we're trying to keep all the other lobbyists from getting their way. We kind of view ourselves as lobbyists on behalf of the American taxpayer. So normally how this works is, you as a citizen, a voter, you're not happy. So you call your member of Congress. Your member of Congress can either agree or disagree, and then they vote. Whereas lobbyists are pushing from the other side, trying to convince members of Congress to vote other ways, or in support of their exemptions or subsidies or carve-outs, and they have a lot of money. So it's not that every single member of Congress is necessarily prone to falling for that, but it's significant influence, and it's something that the average voter cannot really compete with. So we wanted to create something on the other side, and we kind of look at it as a kind of a triangle, so to speak, in that you pressure your members of Congress, we give you information, you give us information, and on our side we also lobby members of Congress. And it's kind of, the way we view it is a conservative intelligence gathering operation. In fact, through our Sentinels, which is basically our activists that we work with very closely with members of Congress and their networks in those districts, they get information often way faster than the whip can in D.C. And the whip is the person who's trying to figure out basically how the Republican caucus is going to vote. And by kind of beating them to the punch on our side of things, we can talk to our activists in real time, they can update us in real time. We can then figure out how the Republican caucus is positioned, and then we can message, try to get ahead of issues, try and push it this way or that way. It gives us a powerful advantage as conservatives back in our home districts that just really wasn't there before. And there's other organizations like us that do a really good job as well. We just think that combined with our kind of hallmark think tank that's been around for a long time, it gives the conservative movement a huge advantage when you take into account all these other great organizations that are doing similar type of action and work. So what do? We basically focus on accountability. So we have a scorecard, and actually I'll pass that out right now. Just take one and pass it down. And our scorecard is a rating on a scale of 0 to 100% on how conservative your member of Congress is voting. Now, this is a very topical approach. This is not the whole story. This is a starting point, and it's meant to inform people, to give them a brief overview on the most revealing and most important legislation where our members of Congress are voting. Now, this doesn't grade everything. For instance, you could have an 80%, but you're doing a lot behind the scenes. You're supporting amendments, you're writing amendments, you're doing a lot of stuff in committees, you're doing a lot of stuff behind closed doors. That type of action in a more holistic approach could bump you up to, darn near 100%. We just can't score that kind of stuff because it's subjective. Conversely, you could have a 95% on our scorecard. Behind the scenes, you're voting the right way, but behind the scenes, you're doing a lot of things to kind of hinder or hurt conservative efforts. You're killing amendments in the Rules Committee, or what. There's a whole bunch of things you could be doing behind the scenes. So this is really a starting point. Anyways, if you go online at heritageaction.com, you can actually pull up the scorecard. You can look at your member of Congress. You can see how they're voting. John Carter is currently one of the lower scores of the Republicans in the state. That's not to say that he is a liberal. That's not to say that he's a rhino. That's not my determination. But that is to say that there's room for improvement. And certainly, one of the purposes we want to fulfill is to help voters in their districts, if they think that their member is underperforming, to encourage him or her to improve upon that. And we want to give them the data and the information to help them do that. In some districts, a 70% is a really good score. In other districts, a 70% is a really terrible score. It depends, again, on kind of a holistic view of the district. We are currently in an R+12 district, which means that out of every 100 voters, 62 are Republican. This is a extremely conservative congressional district. It's very safe. It's very unlikely that Representative Carter would lose to a Democrat in a general election. That's not to say that we should just give up and not go vote and not go door knock. We do need to make sure that our Republican members win in November. It's not a give me, but it is fairly certain. It's a strong district. So what does all this mean? It means that in conjunction with our scorecard, looking at the types of things they're voting on, you're the constituents. We want you to decide. We're not here to tell you that your member needs to be replaced. We don't get involved in elections. We're not here to tell you that your member is right or wrong. We provide you information, and you make that determination yourself. Your member of Congress does not represent our scorecard. They represent you. And if you agree with our scorecard, then that's great. But we want to make sure that your member is having the conversation. So a lot of times we have members of Congress who score in the 75 to 80% range, but they do not have outreach. They do not talk to their constituents. They do not explain their votes. We want this conversation to be had. So if your member has a 65, a 55%, somewhere around that range, and they're comfortable with that, and they're talking to you about their votes, and you're fine with that, and you agree with their logic, then that's great. We just want that conversation to be had, and we want that information to be out there. Again, that's up to you in this district to decide if that's good enough or not. So real briefly, I'm going to go over a couple of the votes on our scorecard in this district on why we think that that's underperforming, areas that we think that could be improved upon. Now, agriculture is a big issue that Representative Carter, that we would disagree on some of his votes. Now, that's not to say we don't agree with ag bills. I'm from the Midwest. I've grown up in rural communities. My fiance's parents are cattle farmers. I'm very interested in making sure we have good agricultural policy. But the food stamp and farm bill was a perfect example. This was 80% food stamps, no significant reforms. We wanted them to separate it out instead of lumping together $800 billion in food stamps and $200 billion in agricultural spending. We wanted them to separate it out. Let's look at each one on their own merits, figure out what we need and what we don't need. And perhaps the 200 in the ag bill is legit. Perhaps not. Our argument would be there are some fat to be trimmed there. There were some subsidies in there that just were probably not defensible. There's some subsidies for things like sugar that artificially increase the prices of sugar. There's a whole bunch of little things like this that are just not free market reforms that we wanted to push aside. Unfortunately, a lot of Republicans did not want to do that. They relied upon passing their kind of pork ag spending with votes from Democrats because they want their pork food stamp spending. So again, we wanted to strip it out, make substantive reforms, cut spending, save American taxpayers money. We did that with a lot of arm twisting. That was a big victory. were able to convince the House Republicans to actually do that. Unfortunately, on the backside of things, they didn't reform either one, and then they just lumped it back together and passed it in one big bill again. So it was kind of a show. So there's a lot of ag votes that we would disagree with Representative Carter on. We'd like to see some accountability or some discussions on the future. Maybe that's something that he can improve upon from our perspective, or maybe he can defend his votes to you and you're satisfied with that. Again, that's up to you. Some of the other areas that we see some problems with would be things like the RSC budget, which was a very conservative budget. It did a lot to balance the budget, it did a lot to cut spending, and a lot to cut taxes.
What budget?
The RSC, the Republican Study Committee budget, it was the better of the two budgets. Representative Carter voted against that. He did vote for the Ryan Murray budget, which increased spending by $63 billion over the next 2 years, increased taxes through fees. It actually did cut, for a time, cost of living adjustments for disabled veterans' pensions. There was just a lot of bad things in there. It was not a conservative budget. This was something we voted on. He did vote for the omnibus spending bill, which was 12 spending appropriations bills combined together into one big one that was over $1.1 trillion in total. The problem with this is that on 6 of those appropriations bills, Republicans actually granted more spending than Obama requested. And so we see this as very problematic when Republicans are giving more money to President Obama than he's even requesting. Now, this was not all the work of Representative Carter. He voted for it. I'm sure that if you were to ask him, or if things were in his favor, he would absolutely vote for more spending cuts. But that's just not what was on the table. You'll have, our recommendation was to vote against it anyways. Perhaps he can defend that, perhaps not. That's up to him. I'm not going to speak for him or on his behalf. There's some other things, little things like the Essential Air Services. It's a federal program. It's basically pointless and useless. There's a whole bunch of little knick-knack votes that would have saved taxpayers a lot of money. Unfortunately, and I'm not going to go through every single one, but there's quite a few on there. When you have a 55%, and now keep in mind, the House average, I think, is 62%. That's over the entire country. We would expect, generally speaking, a Republican from the state of Texas to be above that, and especially in an R+12 district. That is something, keep in mind, Ted Cruz is in an R+10. So technically, the constituency that Ted Cruz is representing is less Republican on the whole than this district, this congressional district. And Ted Cruz has a 98% on our scorecard. That's quite a difference. Now, we're not purists. We do understand it's okay for Republicans and conservatives to disagree. We don't hold the gold standard at 100%. We kind of set an artificial threshold around 90. In a very Republican district, 90 is great. That doesn't mean if you don't have a 90 that we're not going to say, hey, good job. If you're above 80%, we'll probably say, hey, that's pretty good too. It's okay for Republicans to disagree, and it's okay for us to have substantive debate on these issues. But it becomes problematic when on almost half of these votes, we're kind of missing the conservative byline on where we need to be voting. We do think that every member of Congress can improve. And every single Congress is a little bit different. We're always voting on different issues and different subjects, so we would certainly love it if John Carter improved. And it doesn't have to be substantial, it doesn't have to be quick, but over the next Congress or two, if he's able to win, then we would like to see that go up. That means that he's listening to his constituents, looking at the conservative side of these votes, and starting to kind of agree with us on those issues and you as conservative voters. There's others, and I won't go over every single vote on there, but there's a lot. You can go on our website and look at it. We also have blogs, which kind of keep you updated on legislative issues, what's important, what's not. And again, this all hinges around our kind of back and forth relationship with what we call Sentinels, which is a free program. There's no requirements to sign up for this. We do have Monday calls where you can kind of listen in on what's going in. It's about a 15-minute call. It's a nationwide call where you can kind of listen in and see what's going on in D.C. this week. What's the big legislation? Why is it important? What's the conservative perspective on this? Etc. It's actually one of the best phone calls I've ever been on, and I've been on a lot of conference calls. It's probably my favorite part of the week. I graduated magna cum laude out of University of Texas at Dallas in political science, I've learned more in a year and a half on those 15-minute phone calls on Mondays than I ever did in college. You will learn a lot on this phone call, and it will make you a more powerful activist, a more powerful conservative Republican voter. Because what I've learned, and this isn't the fault of members of Congress, they are very busy, they don't have the time that some of us have to focus on these legislative issues for a lot of reasons. But if you were on this phone call for a year on a lot of these legislative issues, you will know more about that issue than your congressman will. And that's, again, that's not a knock on your congressman. Congressmen have to travel a lot, they're in committee meetings, they have to kiss babies, they have to raise money, they have to run elections. They're busy. And that's why they have staff, so they can lean on them. But you will basically, after a year, be essentially a legislative assistant at the very least on your level of knowledge on federal issues. And I've been in congressional offices before, so I can say that rather confidently. It's that good of a phone call. Anyways, again, there's no requirements to be in the Sentinel program. It's just if you have 30 seconds and you want to move the needle on conservative issues, I would love to help you and point you in the right direction. One simple phone call can make a big difference. And anyone here who's worked in an elected official's office before will tell you that a phone call, especially if there's 100 of them in a district office, that makes a big deal. And there's 730,000 plus people in a congressional district. If you make 100 phone calls on a vote to a district office, that they will think, hey, what's going on here? I mean, I've been there at the end of a day where we got 100 phone calls on a small bill, and people are like, what's going on? Why 100 phone calls on this little tiny bill? It's because, activists and networks are trying to drive attention to these issues. So that's kind of an overview of what Heritage Action does, how we work with our Sentinels, kind of our resources. We do a lot of policy analysis, and I kind of have to be, I'm not an issue expert, but I'm kind of a jack of all trades analyst on just about every single legislative issue, because I have to, every week, know what's going on in Congress and kind of jump from issue to issue. So I don't focus on just agricultural policy. I don't focus on just economic policy. I have to focus on kind of everything. So I'm going to kind of paint a picture of what we're focusing on this summer, and then I'm going to open up to questions, and it can be about anything. It can be about policies, immigration, anything, and then we'll kind of run out the time, and they'll let me know when I'm going low. But this summer, we really see immigration policy as a big deal. Now, understand that I am very pro-legal immigration, and we are a nation of immigrants. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for immigration. That's a great thing. We also have to understand that in our current entitlement welfare state, we have to be a little bit more selective and careful on how we do legal immigration. And unfortunately, and I've got some data on this over there, unfortunately, because of the kind of the progressive nanny state and the entitlement welfare system, with the lack of reforms that are badly needed, and the demographics of those who are here illegally, it becomes very problematic if we start entering into a legal status. So this isn't to say that that couldn't change, that perspective couldn't change over time if we were able to have massive welfare reform and entitlement reforms. But the average, there's roughly 3,500,000 illegal households, and that's as of 2010, the census. That number's obviously higher now. The average net fiscal burden, and this is a utilitarian argument, there's much more to it, these are human beings, they're not just X's, No's, dollars, and cents. But the average household has a negative fiscal burden yearly of $14,387. Now, that's not to say that there aren't illegals that are net contributors, that work very hard, that put into society and contribute. That's just to say that in a demographic of that many households, where we know well north of 50% have either very little high school education or no high school education, the social demographics of that type of education background, if you look at the amount of data we have on legal immigrants and citizens with the same educational background, it's just not very promising. And that is without direct access to direct benefits. If you're an illegal immigrant, you do not get, technically, you do not get access to direct benefits. Now, you do get some direct benefits, like hospitals and things like that, emergency rooms. You get indirect benefits through children. And that's great. We don't want kids out there starving. We want kids that aren't in school. Those are all great things. The problem is when you have a legal status. Anyone who's here permanently over a long period of time and is granted a legal status, even if you call it temporary, the courts will very likely look at that as what's called a lawful permanent resident. If you are an LPR and you've lived here for 5 years, you will very likely be considered what's called a qualified immigrant. And qualified immigrants do have access to entitlement benefits. They do have access to Social Security. They do have access to Medicaid, Medicare, all of the things that regular legal immigrants would have access to. So from a fiscal perspective, the net burden yearly from those households after amnesty would be completed through a legal process, and that doesn't even include a right to vote, you're looking at about $27,000 to $29,000 net burden per year. So this is why, from a fiscal perspective, until a lot of things happen, our position is that we should not be talking about a legal status. In fact, we don't think we should be pushing immigration until after the elections at all, simply because the way the legislative process would work is the Senate would would mark it up really badly in the ways that Republicans didn't want anyways, and then they would vote on it that way. It would be a terrible bill. And it would either go to a conference committee, or Nancy Pelosi could call a discharge petition and use 10 to 20 Republicans to pass it over the vast majority of the Republican Party. And there's nothing we can do about it. So there's a lot of reasons we want to wait until Republicans control the Senate, so we can guide the process and control it and keep it from going out of control. The other big one is the Export-Import Bank. The Export-Import Bank is basically it's a government program agency that uses your tax dollars, gives it to overseas companies to buy American products. Now, their claim is it supports jobs. It doesn't create jobs, because that claim has been debunked by CBO and all these other economic institutes. It doesn't create any jobs. They also claim that it actually returns money to the American taxpayer. We know that's not true. The CBO just came out with a study showing that it actually costs taxpayers $2 billion. But the other problem here is that, and I'll give you an example here, they secure private lending for Air India to buy Boeing airplanes. Now, Boeing's like, this is great, we're selling airplanes, we're creating jobs. The problem is that Air India competes against United, which is a domestic air carrier, and they don't qualify for loans that great. So they're basically at a competitive disadvantage. So we're benefiting Boeing at the expense of United. This is happening all across the spectrum. 80% of the money goes to big, well-connected organizations. They say it's for little companies, mom-and-pop companies. That's not true. In fact, only 2% of the loans going out there are considered competitive, meaning that we're going up against other countries that have subsidies. And most of these could be secured through private companies anyways. So basically what we have is the federal government is picking winners and losers in the marketplace, using your dollars to do it. If the corporation makes money, then they keep it. If they lose money, it's going to come in the form of, just like we saw with Fannie and Freddie, a taxpayer bailout. So they're privatizing profits and publicizing losses. This is just not free market. This is not the way that our Republican Party should be voting. We are very staunchly positioned against the Export-Import Bank, and we expect every single Republican to vote against it. We have some information on all the arguments against it. Anyways, that is kind of, in a nutshell, our big issues we're facing this summer. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other issues going on. We've got Benghazi, we've got foreign policy, we've got the IRS scandal. We focus mainly on what's going on in Congress, not necessarily the executive branch and his lawlessness and all the executive orders that he's passing without any precedent. So with that, are there any questions on anything I've covered? I only have a couple minutes left at most. Yes?
I do. It's interesting about what you thought. I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Perhaps you can represent this from America and see what your opinion would be on this question. Why do you think we lost the presidential election last time?
This is a personal opinion, not that of Heritage Action, because this is an electoral question and not a legislative question. I've seen a lot of the post-election analysis and from some professors that I actually studied under, and I think that one is we didn't paint in bold pictures. That's not to say that Romney wouldn't have been a good president, or Romney didn't put forth a good effort, but there was a failure, I think, to go out there and cast Obama as the bad guy. So without knowing anything about Star Wars, you know that Darth Vader is bad. You know Luke Skywalker is good. Luke Skywalker did not go out there and start talking about how nice and how Darth Vader is probably a good dad and he's a nice guy and likable. He painted him as the bad guy.
And I think that we have to be a little bit more honest in how we paint our adversaries. And listen, Obama might be a good guy, but his policies are absolutely evil. They're bad. They have devastating consequences on people. And I think we need to be more forthright and kind of painting them in those pictures, pointing out the harm that they're actually doing to the American people. And also, just from kind of a more wonkish point of view, the studies indicated that Romney did not come off as having good leadership. Now, you can question that a million ways from Sunday on what that means, but they saw Obama as a leader. They did not see Mitt Romney as a leader. I don't have an answer for why that is, but that's just what a lot of studies show.
The agriculture bill you mentioned, did that include ethanol subsidies and mandates?
You know what? I'm actually not sure. I wouldn't be. I'm pretty positive those are probably in there. That might be a part of another bill. But there were things in there like direct subsidies for farmers with an adjusted gross income of $1.2 million. That's adjusted gross income. Anyone who's making $1.2 million a year should not be getting taxpayer subsidies. But there was just a lot of little things like that. I'm not sure. I'll look, if you can send me an email, I'll look up that specifically if there was ethanol subsidies in there. But I wouldn't be surprised. Yes?
I had a question about how the scorecard was scored.
Okay.
A lot of scorecards I've seen, and I don't know if you can speak to this or not, are it's not all legislation, it's certain selected legislation.
Right.
Is that true in this case?
Yes, and so one of the dangers there is if you get involved electorally, it can be viewed that you're targeting members. We don't get involved electorally, we don't have a stake in elections, we just focus on accountability. As long as you're happy with your member of Congress, then that's great. So we go after votes where we think that there's a revealing conservative principle at play. And then we weigh every single vote the same. Every vote counts as 1 point, and then you just divide by the total of how many you got versus how many we scored. It also includes a handful of co-sponsorships on bills that we really think need to be pushed forward. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are a number of organizations that score.
Right.
And, I mean, to me, there is an electoral side to this. I mean, you may look at it from a subjective standpoint. There's an electoral side that obviously the members would answer to this.
So on your side of the scorecard, absolutely. There is, and from your perspective. From our perspective, it doesn't matter if that member serves 40 years or is replaced next election. That's a conversation for you to have with your member. Our objective is simply to determine whether or not these votes are in the big picture, if these are representing conservative principles or not. And that's up to you if a 55 is conservative or not. We're not going to tell you it is or isn't. That's for you to decide. Does that answer your question? Thank you very much. I'll stick around, by the way, if anyone has any more questions. I'll be